I'd like to invite all of the panelists to join me now. Also with Shameen, with the video and with your speakers and microphones on. Christina and Caroline and Tony, thanks. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book A Man's Search for Meaning. Do you know this book, right? He also talked about the stimulus and the response, and that the space between this gave us growth and freedom. So it's very closely, from a mystical standpoint, or even you maybe say a religious view. You guys are all nodding, you're smiling, you know exactly what I'm talking about. How have you dealt with this uncertainty, this being in limbo in your, as business owners, in making decisions in the last 2 months in such unstable, uncertain circumstances?
You want to start?
Sure.
Okay. Maybe I think this situation has strengthened our relation between our investors and employees, both. Because, for example, with our investors, we have shown that we have quickly react to the situation, because it's quite important to really quick, for example, to reduce external costs, to be confident about our funds. We have reforecast our business plan, and because now the goal is to reach break-even shortly, because it's we don't know, for example, for the fundraising part, when it will start. So and with that, we shown that we have strengthened our relationship with investor, because he was quite confident that we will surpass the crisis. And I think it's quite important to have this strong communication with the investor, especially for a startup. And with our employees, we have shown a lot of things, a very interesting thing. For example, of course, we work remotely now, and we have shown that even because we are remote, we are more close, because we have improved the way we work. A lot of people now want to have more remote after the post-crisis, to work remotely after the post-crisis, because I think we have seen that it's possible to work great perfectly in house. So it's quite interesting to do that. And we have improved the way we work. For example, for our meeting are more prepared and more efficient in Visio, because it could be short, because all the thing is prepared now. So thanks to this situation, we have strengthened our relationship with his partners, employees, investors.
Thanks, Tony. Caroline, when again, this limbo, this space between, as a business owner, how do you react to this? What were your first thoughts as you were going into lockdown?
Yeah, so from our end, I think back in January, we kind of started seeing a bit of an impact already, because our customers are luxury fashion brands who were already impacted from China. But to be completely honest, I didn't take it very seriously at the time. I kind of thought, this is not going to be as bad. And, I was still traveling and doing everything and meeting with clients. But then I think quite suddenly then in February, we were like, okay, this is actually serious. So from our side, we saw very sudden drop off in client contracts. Everything started to go on hold. So we kind of thought, okay, well, now we need to quickly act on this. So had to kind of, I guess, reassess of what is happening to the market and our client base as an opportunity, and what are our resources, and just trying to find a balance between of extending our runway to the possible maximum that we can without completely stripping it down in the event that once the market starts to recover, we're not like one person. But yeah, I think making those decisions as early as possible. I could have done it a bit earlier, to be honest. But that's kind of been critical for us. Luckily, we had some fundraising last year, so we are able to do this. But yeah, the revenue impact's been quite significant for us. But yeah, I think it's one of these things where, you know, you're talking about how a situation like this, like we actually also have to completely rethink and see, is the use case that we were selling to our clients before for our product the same during this and after this? And actually there seems to be quite a lot of new ways to use our product, which require quite small technical changes, but a completely new opportunity. So there's also a lot of really interesting stuff like this happening and kind of forcing us to look at things from the outside and not just kind of continue doing what we were doing before.
Thanks. Christina, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to throw you a curveball. And the curveball is liminality. This idea of before in this space can be perceived, depending on your character, as a desert experience, empty, desert, dry, no water, water is life, right? Or it can be perceived as a mountaintop experience, as a transitional opportunity. And if you look at the religious books written through the different religions, we see this liminality as mountaintop experiences or desert experiences. If you had to choose which of those for you has been the last 2 months, has this been a mountaintop experience for you, or has this been a desert?
Oh, wow. That's a good one, Rob. Well, basically for us, we are a well-diversified, large organization. So of course we're facing different situation than the guys, Tony and Caroline, are facing. And yes, we are in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. Mm-hmm. So I have to say that for us, having resources is a massive advantage. And what we have been doing is trying to be creative, think of the resources that we need to shift and how we're shifting them wisely, build more adaptability and agility into our models. And by that, I mean how we interact, what do we use to interact with the consumers, and what are the tools and methods we use to assess our business models. Mm-hmm. So for example, switching from the longer term view when we assess our business on 1 year, 3 years time frame to shorter terms where we do the rolling forecasts. Mm-hmm. And that's been quite an immediate change for us. Mm-hmm. So of course, having those resources of the big organization, we had an opportunity also to think of how we invest into digital, and the digital transformation has been really leading the way now. It's funny to see that slide that we saw on Shameen's presentation with the who really pushed your digital transformation. I mean, I don't want to offend anybody from the leadership, but it is true that this situation now pushed our organization and many others into this steep curve of development in digital. So if I were to choose between the two, I would definitely choose that mountain experience, even though it is a mountain experience like climbing Mount Everest, without being fully prepared to climb it. Right. But I think we are getting there, yes.
Yeah. Again, you know, Shameen, you also focus on entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are known for mountaintop people, not for desert people, and just in the general perception about how they're pursuing life. Otherwise, it would be too risky. Shameen, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And at the same time, I think also it's also about, you know, the grunt work when, you know, the spotlights are turned off, you know. And so I think with entrepreneurs, there's that combination of the mountaintop, but also the to some extent toiling in the desert. And I think the ability to handle the two matter. And just to reflect a little bit on what we just heard, one of the things that Tony said was, look, it's really efficient. And I think that just reminds me that what we do before a crisis also matters greatly in how we're able to manage the liminality of a crisis, because there's social capital you've invested in before, and people on the team are comfortable with each other. Now in this situation, they're able to work fine. But if people weren't already, you know, that process of bonding hadn't happened before, I think it would be much harder. And I think even listening to Christina from a big company perspective, I mean, I think they just did a lot of things beforehand. There was a lot of thought that went through. And I think Caroline as well, you know, admitting that maybe it took a while to recognize what was happening, but she's here, she's on her feet, and we're having this conversation because she then moved fast. And I think also partly what this reflects, and this goes in a way to answering your question, Rob, it's also about what entrepreneurs do when you know, away from the glare of spotlights. It's all of that grunt work that also pays off in the liminal phase.
Thanks. I like that. I like that. Don't forget the hard work, not just the glamour part of I'm a startup or whatever, right? Run my own firm, you know, the work to get there and the commitment and the risk and the money and the sacrifice. So I'd like to come back to Tony, you and to Caroline. You're both in the basically tech industry. The premise of your industry and your business doesn't really rely on, doesn't necessarily rely on human interaction at the team level. And some would say, are the winners in this pandemic, right?
Yes.
In versus with others that are heavily focused on customer relationship management, being at the front, like education, like we are. We don't have students since 6 months now, right? To what extent is this true for you as technologists and technology-driven companies? Caroline?
So it's true for us internally. Like, yes, you know, as Tony mentioned as well, we can pretty much continue doing everything that we did for the business itself like we did before. But for us, the problem is our clients who are quite heavily dependent on that. So we are feeling the indirect knock-on effect of that. So obviously, yeah, there are companies, you know, like Zooms and things where they're doing incredibly well right now. But I think for us as being a tech product that sells to these companies who are severely affected, it's a tricky one.
Okay. Tony, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. Very bluntly, has this last 2, 3 months, 4 months significantly changed the trajectory of your firm?
Yes, of course, yes, because we have the same clients than Caroline, so luxury and fashion industry, so it's impacted a lot since several months. So before the crisis, we have a huge growth about our product, and now it's quite stopped. So it has impact in short term, but actually in the long term for us, it's a huge opportunity because we use a lot of data that could provide a lot of insight for our customers. So it's quite important that for the short term, it's impact a lot because a lot of we have a lot of churn during this months. But now things are changing because our clients now want to have some insights for the future because thanks to our solution, we give them some insights for the future trends. So it's key for them to have this kind of insights because we analyze social media, and for now it's only the only data available. So it's quite important for them to use this kind of insight to take some decision and to know what's going on the future. So for us, it's a huge opportunity for long term, let's say, at the end of the year.
So did either of your firms have already in advance contingency plans, plan B, plan C, or did you have to make this up as you're going along day to day?
Not this kind of contingency plan, no. Of course, it was totally unexpected with this kind of impact. So no, the goal, I think it's the matter of small team and startup. We need to react fast and to be agile. And of course, 1 week before the lockdown in Paris, for us, it was quite a normal situation. And after that, on one day, we all the team was in remote, and we have reforecast our business plan in 1 day. And so the goal is to react fast, because otherwise it was very difficult to forecast that.
Do you think that all of your firms are going to be forced into having these types of contingency planning going forward, especially vis-a-vis investors? You know, you've got especially larger single individual investors who will say, wait a minute, I'm not giving you cash until I see, you know, this something else could happen again. What have you been at least tentatively thinking about what to do with my money? if yeah. You know, don't you feel like there's in general, a step back towards just throwing money at business?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'd imagine so, for sure. I think anyone raising money right now will be under extreme scrutiny, and probably, you know, also the terms and things won't be what they were before. Equally, I think it's, you know, it's so hard to predict things in the world. I'd imagine that this will probably require a contingency plan in an event similar to this, but then again, who knows what might happen. Yeah, I think it will increase. There will be another level of diligence for something like this.
Christina, I'd like to come to you again, working for a larger organization who we generally tend to think has more resources, more people, more contingency planning in place. It's not, again, we like to think that. It's not always the case. I'd like to ask you, though, specifically, what lessons do you think, especially the mid-size and larger corporates are learning from this crisis that can improve your performance going forward?
Right. Well, of course, we had contingency plans, and just like any big organization, you are forced by many reasons to think in advance, and to, when we build our business plan, when we build our budget, of course, we have that sum of money that is devoted to this contingency planning. But I have to assure, I don't think anybody was prepared for such a dramatic situation. In our organization, we are well diversified. And of course, as you're well diversified, you think that you are well hedged to this situation. But when the whole world is closed and when all of your retail locations are closed, you are doomed to think of other ways, and of course shift resources and so on. Some of the key learnings I think that we have been looking at is, of course, to go through the digital transformation much faster, to focus on the data analytics, so the big data, the smart data, predictive analytics. That is something super important. And another part that I wanted to say is, of course, we talk about business models, but I think it's also a lot about talking about trust within the organization, trust with our consumers, and trust with our management. Because at the end of the day, the transparency, building this communication that is cooperative, that is helpful, is something that will lead us in the future. And even in the case of, for example, Sephora, it starts to reopening the stores now. We have reopened in China, we're starting to reopen in Europe. And in this case, communicating with consumer, explaining them what they, how they can interact with us is crucial. And same for the employees. Now we all work remotely. And what does it mean for the management to trust their employees and, let's say, not to do the random checkups on whether you perform or not is also very important, and something that will definitely carry forward and hopefully will be, help us to lead in the future.
Thank you. Shameen, any thoughts? You're on mute.
Yeah. I resonate with all of the things I'm hearing. And again, what Christina was saying about trust and the ability to explain with honesty and so on. I think that goes back to what I was talking about earlier as well, you know, in that spirit of communitas that anthropologists talk about, where people recognize that we're all struggling together and there's a sense of solidarity. But again, I emphasize, as I did in my presentation, this can also be quite temporary. And so how you leverage this in the moment is important. And I think also what you put in the efforts that you've made in the past to build that trust, to build social capital within the company and outside, these will pay off big time at times like these.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to address is, again, this contingency planning. And often you hear entrepreneurs, especially, this phrase of, I pump all my profits back into the business. I live lean, we stay lean, and we keep pumping all the money back into the business to keep growing. And at the same time, you have Shameen, who's talking about agility. So through this issue that we're going through right now, this crisis that we're going right now, there's sort of a lesson learned of, well, maybe I shouldn't put all my money back in. Maybe many firms, I'm watching the firms that have no liquidity are just dying. They don't have pockets. They don't have pockets at all on their clothes, much less deep pockets. And they don't have friends who they can turn to, meaning good investors who will stick through them through the mid and the long term. Is this going to, what effects is this going to have for us? So if you're going to need to have a certain sort of a financial resources going forward and not being able to develop as fast, as risky, what does this mean?
I think also with in our case, a lot of our costs are salary cost. So one of the decisions that we had to make was, do we reduce everyone's pay, or do we remove some people but keep other people's pay up? We decided to completely remove some people, taking advantage of some of the furlough schemes available, at least here in the UK. We decided not to reduce the salaries from the people that remained, following a lot of discussions about motivation and how does this impact everyone psychologically as well as being part of the team. So we kind of decided, okay, well, we'll assess who are the strongest team members and let's get them to feel still really committed to what we're doing. We're lowering our cost base, and then the other people can also still benefit from the government support income. But again, it's a difficult decision on what to do in that case.
This goes back to the desert part of your work. This is the hard work and the very hard decisions. No one's prepared us for those hard things, because these are friends, they're family, not just, yeah. Tony, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's a difficult part to trade off, to say, okay, we need to reduce costs. So the first time we have reduced external costs. So we realize that it's possible to optimize something because we have a lot of costs for the infrastructure, cloud costs. So it's quite easy to reduce that. But after that, of course, the most of our cost is salary. Thanks to the government, we are able in France to do some partial employment. So it's a good way to reduce the cost during the crisis. We hope that in the next following months, the business will restart and we can go back with the full potential with all the team. But if the crisis will last longer, we will need to actually maybe have some cost reduction with the salary. So it's quite difficult things. But luckily, as Caroline, we have done a fundraising last year, so we are not in financial distress for this year. So it's more comfortable than other startups that have huge needs of money. And luckily, for the next year, it's possible for us to reach break-even. And it's often not always an objective for a startup to reach a break-even, because we really want each time to grow fast. And sometimes we realize that we can grow fast, but at the same time maybe look around the cost on the daily basis to be more profitable quickly.
Great, thanks. Shameen, from a systemic perspective, what do you see?
Ooh, I'm not sure whether what I'm about to say is quite so systemic, but one of the things, interesting things I heard from Gregor Gimi, former co-founder of BMW Startup Garage, who's behind this initiative I mentioned called Startups Against Corona. You know, it comes down to what the actual situation for a given company is. So in some cases, it apparently is the case that big companies are really cash strapped, but there are some startups, maybe like in Tony's case, who got funding just before everything went to pot and actually are well-funded. And so in cases like that, he says, it's actually these well-funded startups who are in the position to drive innovation, and these big companies are better off just accessing innovation of these startups. And of course, there's still an issue around resources, but then there are creative solutions as well in how the big company can compensate the startup. But then there are some cases where it's exactly the other way around. There are a number of entrepreneurs I've been speaking to who are actively talking to potential funders, things were looking promising, and then all of this happened. And in those cases, I find that where they've had already some promising discussions with big companies as clients, they've been able to quickly at least be able to use them as customers. So a Shanghai-based entrepreneur who had been talking to this French multinational for a while, and then the crisis happened, and then he just made some adjustments to a offering that he had, made it even more relevant for the COVID-19 situation. And this big company gave them a big order. So it seems to me that we need to look for specific dyads, specific cases of startups and big companies, who is actually in the better position. And I think from maybe the systemic way to look at this is who is able to do the matchmaking and create these interfaces. And that's what I like about the Startups Against Corona project, because it is backed by deep expertise in bringing together these disparate companies, because these guys did this for a number of years in BMW. And so I think, and I do think that this sort of scaffolding is available there. And I think maybe business schools like ours also have a role to play in providing scaffolding, because, for example, a school like CEIBS, we have the access to entrepreneurs and the large company managers, and trust, again, to some extent, gets developed in these kinds of communities.
Thank you. Before I open it up to a couple of the questions that we've got coming in from the audience, every time that we do these webinars, we ask someone to be observing and listening and reflecting with us, who's one of our partners, who's just kind of in the background. And today we've got Dave Hertig. Dave is founder and CEO of a firm called Content Success. Hi, Dave. Dave is just, without going too much into what he's doing, the main thing I brought Dave in for today was he's just completed, in the last few weeks during this crisis, interviewing 30 CEOs who are entrepreneurs, smaller firms, like we saw in many of the participants here would resonate with this, because it's not the big CEOs, it's the smaller ones. So Dave, just 1 or 2 minutes commentary, reflection from you about what you're hearing in light of your 30 CEO interviews from the last weeks.
Yeah, I have agreed with Hannah to just tell you a small story about Isabel. She has a startup, iFitYou is the company, 10 people, and they have developed a technology that helps you pick the right size of your garment without trying it on. And that sounds like a very good thing, because that's absolutely needed right now. She provided me with an article, or sent me the link to an article written in April by McKinsey. And they said, here are 7 elements for business leaders to consider as you plan your way forward and for the next normal. And the third point on that list was the rise of the contact-free economy. And of course, they mentioned the e-commerce. They also mentioned telemedicine and automation. And one example that they gave in their paper is that in Italy alone, e-commerce transactions have risen 81% since the end of February. So we all would think that this is the perfect marketplace right now for Isabel. And unfortunately for her, it kind of is, but she has to be patient at the moment because the business that she is in, the fashion industry, and we heard about it quite a bit today, is still struggling. And as she puts it, everybody wants to survive first and then we can lead into the future. So what she does right now, and I think that's the HL part of it, is she just shows her face in the marketplace and she wants to be helpful through her communication online. And that's the story, Robert.
Thanks. I live by 29 mottos in my life. And one of the mottos is survival is success sometimes. And that's where we are right now, right? Survival is succeeding right now. So Dave, thanks. I know you've got to run to another appointment. Thanks for those insights. I'd like to go now and open up the questions from some of the participants. We've got one question from specifically for you, Shameen. How do we approach innovation during these times when there's limited resources, lack of funds, and big uncertainty? How do we continue to build the innovation ideas, keeping in the mind the practicalities?
So I have a very simple three-word answer.
Yeah.
With great difficulty. Okay. So, I mean, it's a great question from Urvash, and it's a very relevant one, and there are no easy answers. In certain cases, depending on the kind of opportunity that a company was pursuing in the past, there might be opportunity to actually move faster. Some of the healthcare startups, for example, but they are, I think, in the small minority. For the majority, I like that word that David used, which was patience. So this is, and as you said, Robert, actually surviving might be a big accomplishment. But I go back to a word I used when talking about how to keep the panic low, which was bricolage, the term that anthropologists have given us. And so I think that speaks to Urvash's question. When resources are limited, we need to use limited resources. There's another concept, which is frugal innovation, and a term that Urvash will particularly like, which comes from India, which is jugaad. And there are two books written by a couple of authors. The first was called Jugaad Innovation, and the second was called Frugal Innovation. And both come from the same idea that when you're operating in an institutional environment, when you don't have a lot of resources, you make the best of what little there is, but you use it creatively. And it could either be, we use quite limited resources frugally. So think of what GE did, for example, with their portable CT scanner, coming up with something out of China that was 10% of what it cost in the US. A smaller portable thing, may not be with all the bells and whistles, you know, that sort of a. And the other is to take things that we already have, but then use them a little differently, like the hairstylist who used the umbrella as a sort of a social distancing mechanism. So, I mean, I think that's the creativity that's needed to do more with less.
Thank you. We have got another question that came in. It says, I'll just paraphrase it. What's one thing that you hope will remain after the crisis? Tony.
One thing, what will remain? I don't know. I think the best thing is maybe one sentence to say, okay, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I think it's quite important to have in mind a backup plan, something like that, because we need to react fast. I think it's really important. And for us, we have the chance to do that very quickly, but I think it's the most important thing to do, yes.
Mm-hmm. Christina?
I would say entrepreneurial management within big organizations, because I think the organizations, and ours being the example, who can behave in this space, who can have a bit of that frugal innovation will be leading. And it also allows and shows a lot of innovation, gives opportunities to employees and people in different aspects of the business to showcase what they're capable of. And of course, digital transformation all the way to go. So
thank you. Caroline?
Yeah, I think as much as we said, innovation, executing on it currently, it's probably quite challenging. But actually, we're having a lot of really interesting conversations with our clients about things that we can do once things improve. So I think that kind of more open-minded thinking and having ideas and planning for these things, I really hope that will stay. And once things improve, we can actually also execute on those things as well.
Yep, great. Shameen? One thing you hope that stays?
I think this notion of measured improvisation. You know, I think this crisis is forcing people to improvise, to do things differently. But at the same time, because liminality can just really mess with your head, there's also a threat of knee-jerk reactions, overreaching. But if we can sort of build that art of improvising without dying, without overreaching, and then take that with us beyond this crisis, I think, you know, companies will do better, society will be better off.
Great. Thank you. I like that. We're at the end of our hour and 15 minutes. I'm cognizant the number of participants online also have other meetings as well as you do. We will send, in closing, I'd like to say we're going to send a follow-up mail to everyone who's been visiting with us today as participants. Thank you very much for the good questions. Typically, like today, we don't have enough time to answer all the questions. What we do is we send out the questions to the participants and the panelists, and to Shameen and to the panelists, and get some sample answers back from you. And we will send that on to all the participants just to make sure that we have most of the questions answered in some shape or form. If you, the panelists and Shameen, if you guys would be willing to do that, that would be great for us. We will also send probably a short version of Shameen's slide presentation to you to make that available. And typically we make we're making a recording of this. It will be on YouTube. If you want to share this with colleagues and friends and family, we're happy when you do that. As well as we'll be sending you information about the next webinar taking place on global supply chain management. Christina, Caroline, Tony, Shameen, thank you very much for the insights. We wish you all the best in these challenging times of opportunity. I hope that you personally have mountaintop experiences and drag the desert with you to get it done. Thanks so much for your time. Wish everyone, and also to your participants, thanks so much for taking time to listen in and for your great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed being on this. Thank you to the panelists and Robert. That was great moderation. So thank you.
Thank you.